Hello and welcome to the Game Changers podcast, where you'll hear from trailblazing women in sport. I'm Sue Anstiss, a founding trustee of the Women's Sport Trust charity and the founder of Fearless Women, a company with a powerful ambition to drive positive change for women's sport. I'm incredibly grateful to Barclays for supporting this series of the Game Changers, which will focus on fearless women in football, reinforcing Barclays' huge commitment to the beautiful game. In 2019, Barclays announced the largest ever commercial investment in women's sport in the UK. The Barclays FA WSL is now Europe's first fully professional women's football league, and their investment will also help the future growth of the league and its clubs. Along with its fantastic support for professional women's sport, Barclays also invested in establishing the Girls Football School Partnerships, with the aim of ensuring that all girls in England will have equal access to football in schools by 2024. My guest this week is Ebru Koksal. Following a career in New York as a financial analyst at Morgan Stanley, Ebru became the CEO at Galatasaray. She was the first woman to be elected to the executive board of the European Club Association and became the first and only female General Secretary of the Turkish Football Federation. Ebru is now the chair of Women in Football. I started our conversation by asking Ebru about her life growing up in Turkey.
Obviously, in the 70s and 80s, Turkey was not necessarily the most developed and advanced country. It was almost a semi-socialist country. So we were not allowed to travel outside the country unless there was a health emergency or another, major reason. I come from a sort of a lower middle income family, and I didn't really see much of the world until I got to go to college in the US. But we all obviously were pretty well brought up in the sense that education, sports opportunities, I think everything was quite abundant with the exception of girls' football.
And were girls playing other sports? Did you play other sports?
Yes, I did. I started out swimming partially due to health reasons. I have scoliosis since I was 8 years old, and it was recommended by the doctors. I swam for about 6-7 years. I played basketball in high school, and then I realized that I really like team sports, and swimming is, yes, it is part of team sports, but at the end of the day, you're competing individually. So in 1985, I started playing water polo. Okay. And that's one of the hardest sports as well. And I continued playing until after I graduated from college. I played in the US as well. It's one of the hardest sports in the world. So funny enough, girls could play water polo, but they couldn't play football in
Absolutely.
Turkey.
You'd mentioned there your scoliosis diagnosis at 8. So how did that impact your life as a young person, young woman?
I mean, circling back after about 45 years and questioning why I was so driven all the time, wanting to be successful and really having this high achievement personality, it boiled down to those ages of 7, 8, when I thought everything was perfect. I was the perfect girl of my parents, and all of a sudden, the doctors tell me that I am not perfect, and probably going forward, I couldn't do sports. I couldn't have children in the future. So all of that was very heartbreaking. And I felt that my parents didn't love me anymore, which was obviously not the case, but that's in your little 7, 8-year-old mind. You make up these stories. And I thought that maybe if I was simply successful in what I did, whether it was sports or school or work afterwards, that people would love me. So for a very long time, I mixed up love and acceptance with success. And I only realized probably as I turned 50 that I had this pressure always in the back of my mind. And unfortunately, scoliosis is this I don't even want to call it a sickness or illness, or it's a physical disorder that limits many people's lives, but I always fought against it, and I've been extremely active, and I think I'm one of the few cases who has such an advanced level of scoliosis. Mine is past 90 degrees by now.
Wow.
You can't imagine, how bad it is actually, but I still ski, play football every now and then. So I decided back then when I was 8 that I would fight against it all my life.
And you're such a strong and inspiring female. So who inspired you when you were growing up as a younger woman? Were there women in sport or women?
I never thought of going into sports as a career. It was just turn of events in the 10th year of my career. But growing up, I guess my mother, even though she was a lawyer, she never practiced because she had me as soon as she passed her bar exams. But she had her ambitions, which she couldn't fulfill, and kind of passed them on to me, maybe. Mm-hmm. And she would always ask me, so I would come in and say, well, I got, 93 on the math exam. And she'd be like, what did Aisha get? And what did Ahmed get? So it was never good enough for her if somebody else had a higher score than me. So she was always sort of behind the scenes pushing in a way. And then women to look up to, obviously there were some politicians, business leaders that I admired growing up. And for me, success was more associated with titles and power and being part of an impactful organization rather than, money. And some people have more extrinsic motivations, some people have intrinsic motivations. I obviously had a mixture of them, but career-wise, I guess I wanted to be an investment banker. I became an investment banker working at one of the top, Wall Street firms after graduating from Brown University.
So you went to the US as a relatively young person. Did you travel on your own to set up over there?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it wasn't like today. We picked schools without seeing them. I had never been to the US in my life before, and my parents could not afford to take me to school. So I went on my own, 2 suitcases, landed, and we went together with a friend who was going to the same school. And my American roommate met us at the airport in Boston. And they were kind enough to put us up for the night. So I was really happy. And then, we had dinner. And then they said, well, you're going to sleep in the caravan in the garden. We were like, we had never been to the States. I mean, we know nothing about it. But we're so tired. But in the middle of the night, I woke up and woke my friend up. And I just said, imagine if somebody stole this caravan tonight and we wake up in the morning, like not knowing where the hell we are. So we just had the biggest laughing fit, It's so much against the Turkish hospitality. Can you imagine somebody is coming to stay in your house and you're making them sleep in the garden? It was just out of the question for us. My father used to work for the British Leyland Company. And at the time in the 80s, 70s and 80s, it was the only car service repair shop for foreign cars. And any tourists coming through Turkey with their cars would, if they broke down, they would come to this repair shop. And every month he would turn up and say, well, this is John and Jane. Their car broke down. We're expecting pieces from the UK, so they're going to stay with us for a week. So we would have these people that we don't know. They simply, showed up at my father's shop and they would come and stay with us. My parents would give their room and their beds to them, feed them, take them around. So this is what we grew up with, the kind of hospitality. And then having to sleep in the garden, oh my God, this is going to be a nightmare in the US.
How was university? How was Brown?
It was the best time in my life, and for many, many reasons, obviously. We are brought up here quite secluded and protected by our parents, and to be on our own was really different, of course. And I was on always full financial aid. I didn't have any pocket money. My mother used to knit sweaters and send them to me like one a week or one every other week in the mail. And she would put in a $10 bill in between. And I would go out and take that sweater and try to sell it to somebody so I could make some money. I washed dishes, I babysat. I mean, these things were unheard of in Turkey. So it made me, even at the age of 18, realize that unless you worked hard, nothing was gonna happen. So, and the interesting thing is, there is such a mixture of cultures and backgrounds in university. Someone like me with some of the richest families' children from Europe or the US, some very intellectual ones, some very sporty ones, and probably more than half of the college experience and education was who you met, what you learned from them, and how you kept up.
What did you study?
I studied economics and international relations. I was happy with what I studied. It was what I wanted. The only thing is I probably would have studied psychology along with it, because for the next 30 years, it took a lot of my time to figure out why I was doing certain things in a certain way, and what everybody was thinking, doing, acting in that way. So I think psychology is such an important building block of everything that's happening in our private lives, in our work lives, in what drives us, what motivates us, what inspires us, what inhibits us. So definitely, if I were to go back, I would add psychology to the whole
So that mix. And you mentioned there, you went on to work in investment banking in New York. How long were you there for?
2 years, and again, an amazing learning experience. In the 90s, investment banking was quite strict in the way you dress, the way you work, in the hours that you had to spend at work. I mean, it was like at least 130, 140 hours a week. I mean, we would work till 3 a.m, go home, take a shower, come back at 6 or 7. It was extremely competitive, but also a great learning environment. And I got to work in some of the biggest deals in the US at the time, a $2 billion public offering for General Motors, and many of the Fortune 500 companies were clients of the group that I worked in. So it was an amazing learning experience.
What brought you back to Turkey?
Love.
Yay!
I fell in love with a guy who was living in Turkey. We had a long distance relationship for about a year. And then when he proposed, I dropped everything, came back. And luckily, we're still married after 26 years. So not a bad decision after all.
Excellent. That's wonderful to hear, isn't it? And how did your relationship with Galatasaray begin?
Well, after moving back to Turkey, I continued in investment banking. And in 1999, I joined a private equity fund in Turkey, an American fund, who had invested in Vasco da Gama in Brazil. And they were looking at some football assets in Turkey as well. And the first day on the job, they sent me to a meeting with Galatasaray, because the president of the club at the time, he was my former mergers and acquisitions client from Citibank. I had sold his company to Allied Signal a couple years before. What I didn't realize is after, just as I started this new job, I was actually pregnant, but I didn't know at the time. I had just delivered my first child 6 months before. So my kids are 1.5 years apart. And with the first one, I had to go through treatment for 2 years. And it was a nightmare. I mean, every month having to have these shots and the disappointments and everything. So when I realized that I was pregnant in the first month of starting that new job, I was really scared at first. And I couldn't tell my boss for a while. Then I went up to him and explained, look, I'm sorry, I didn't do this on purpose. And I hope you will understand. And really weird enough, the partnership agreement with Galatasaray was signed on the day my daughter was born. And 3 weeks later, my boss called me to his office. I thought it was one of those catching up days. And he was this Italian guy. And to my surprise, he said, well, you have two very young children and you cannot keep up with the pace of the private equity fund. We work very long hours. The job is very demanding and we're going to terminate your contract. And I said, wow, okay, great. And I'm going to walk out of here, hire a lawyer and sue you. So that's what I was planning to do. And then the president of the club, he called me and he said, I heard what happened. I know you're very angry and I know that you are a great investment banker, but would you consider working with us as an interim CFO for 6 months? And I thought about it. My father used to play basketball for Galatasaray.
Oh, wow.
For fans. I used to go with my father to the basketball games, even after he retired. He even took me to football matches once or twice because the stadium environments were not good for little girls,
Yeah.
So I said, why not? I'll park myself there for 6 months and then I'll look for another banking job. And 3 months later, the president who recruited me, he said that he's resigning and going for early elections. The next one came in. He said, can you stay for another 3 months? So one thing led to the other. I was there for 15 years. I worked with 6 different presidents, 10 different boards, became CEO of the whole club, and then joined the board and became the first woman to be elected to the European Club Association board. And I was the only woman until last year. And I'm now very happy to know that Amra Paternel, she's from Red Star Belgrade. She is actually the second woman to be ever elected, 9 years after me. So in between, there was nobody else, unfortunately.
And were there many women working in the club at that time or within football within Turkey at all?
No, not at all. Obviously, there were women in some of the back office roles or, finance or legal departments, some in marketing departments and things like that, but no C-suite women and certainly no CEO. And there has not been a female CEO in Turkey, let alone in much of the rest of the world, if you think about it, of top flight.
I'm going to come on to that in a moment. Can you just talk me through a little bit about your journey to becoming that first female representative on the European Club Association?
Well, it was an interesting experience because, first of all, the big hurdle that I see over the years is women feeling confident enough to run for an office like that. A lot of the times they see an opportunity, they don't think they tick all the boxes, and they don't want the embarrassment or the failure of not winning, so they don't go for such roles. When this opportunity came up, I had just finished the new stadium for Galatasaray, and we were just about to open it. It was a very, very successful period for the club in terms of its operations as well. And I went to the president and I said, listen, I want to run for this role. And normally I would have expected him to probably say, well, it's a man's role, or, let XYZ run for it. Why are you running? Instead, he looked at me and said, I cannot think of a better person to represent Turkey and Galatasaray and women. And he said, go for it. Okay, that's the first hurdle. Then obviously you need to change people's minds because the voters look at you and say, oh, you're so, brave, great. We're very proud that you're trying something like this, but you will never win the election. And I said, fine, if I don't win, I don't win.
Who was voting, Ebru?
27 clubs from the second division. So basically all the clubs that are from sort of the UEFA coefficient ranking from sort of 9 to 15, 9 countries and three or four clubs from each country. So I called up everybody. I explained my background and I explained what I thought I could do for European football, and especially for this middle section, which is always suffering from, they want to be up in the first division. They're not, because their revenues will never get to that level. but they are still very competitive. So they had a lot of expectations as well. And to make the long story short, on the day of the elections, to everybody's surprise, I got the highest votes. And everybody looked at each other. They were like, wow, she made it. So obviously there are several hurdles, but the first one is having the confidence to put your hand up and say, I will try it. If that doesn't happen, the next steps won't come anyways. And if you don't get on that field, you'll never know whether you will win or lose. And chances are, obviously, yes, you will fail, you will lose as well. But if you're not in the field, you won't know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what was reaction like to you?
Well, interesting enough, I think once I made it, everybody was extremely supportive and open, and immediately I was put on some important committees, and especially because I have this very strong financial background, and that expertise was quite important on the board as well. I was part of some task forces that was looking at the distribution of revenues between Champions League and at the time it was UEFA Cup, not the Europa League. So immediately I found myself accepted, let's say, in the board structures. But interestingly, the real acceptance, I think, came when I started playing football with them, because every year at the General Assembly, they usually have a football match. They break into 4 teams. For 2 years, it was only guys playing, myself and the senior representative from Belgium, Mr. Verschuren. He was 80 years old. The 2 of us were watching most of the time. And then I finally said, I want to play. And everyone looked at me and said, are you out of your mind? Edwin van der Sar is playing. Emilio Butragueño is playing. Are you going to get on the field and play with them? I said, why not? Obviously, I can't, do much other than run back and forth, but so be it. And I have some great pictures of that. 4 teams of sort of like 120 people on the field all together, and you look for Waldo in the picture, and there's in the middle.
That's fantastic.
That's really when I felt that by doing the unexpected, I became more part of the inner circle, because what was expected of me was to stay outside, not join, not play, and unfortunately, usually men don't think that you might want to play.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
So the whole arguments these days about diversity, inclusion, I think if you don't make the diverse person included and listened to and heard, then there's no point.
Absolutely right. Absolutely. I imagine, is it really interesting, is it, that rolling up your sleeves and getting involved or putting on your trainers? But there must have been plenty of networking as well within that role. And do you have any advice for women who are needing to network when it is quite a male environment? Because that can be quite intimidating.
I think one of the most important skills in football is networking, and not only in football, but in any, I think, industry and role, and having a targeted approach to it. For me, if I am going to an event, I always look who's coming, who could be there. If there are people that I want to meet or I'm trying to meet, I try to see who else knows them, who can introduce me, how can I catch a moment with them. If I do, what am I going to say? So that elevator pitch, few-minute elevator pitch, we talk about it a lot on our leadership courses, because by chance you get seated at the same table of someone you've been dying to talk to, and you are so scared and so shy and so unprepared that you cannot blurt out what you want to say. So it's all about being prepared. And again, 2 other important things: following up, and not putting aside people if they don't yet have a big title. Like, you never know what I'm going to become tomorrow, or who you might be tomorrow, which club you might work for, or which business you might start. So some of my contacts from 15, 20 years ago, I still stay in touch with, and many of them have become either CEOs or board members at some of the important clubs. And I've never asked for anything from any of them, celebrated their successes, and also kept in touch. There will be a day when I can also ask something from them. So networking is extremely important. And yes, it is intimidating sometimes to walk into a room where 6 men are talking, but we're seeing also interesting things reverse as well for our women in football events. Sometimes there are 30 women and 3 men, and you would see those 3 men in the corner talking to each other. Like they wouldn't walk up to a group of women to go in and talk to and mingle as well. So I think, except for a few in the room, everybody is nervous about networking, but being prepared helps.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you. That's really valuable advice. And in 2011, you became the first female General Secretary of the Turkish Football Association. What did that role involve?
It was a difficult period in Turkish football. There were match-fixing allegations and investigations for 9 clubs in the Super League. And I hesitated a lot when the offer came in. On one hand, it was a great honor to lead all of Turkish football. I think I was obviously that high achieving personality side of mine, found it very attractive and interesting. But then on the other hand, I was somewhat worried because already by then, for 11 years, I was working for Galatasaray, and it wasn't a club that was under investigation. So I knew something could go wrong and some misunderstandings could happen. So I came in basically initially to do only a major restructuring. There were about 600 people working in the Turkish FA, and probably 1/3 too many. So we worked with Accenture for a restructuring plan that would also involve the divesting of the league eventually in 3 to 4 years into a separate entity like the Premier League. But the biggest problem in Turkey is one of consistency and long-term sort of views and planning. So the president, once again, who recruited me after 4 months, he resigned. The new one that came in, we didn't have the same kind of working principles. So 4 months, 5 days later, I was out of my dream job. My job at Galatasaray as CEO was taken. I couldn't go back there as CEO either. So it was probably one of the most difficult times in my life. And I questioned a lot the decision I had made, what would have happened if I had stayed and not gone. But I think it doesn't do any good to keep questioning past decisions because it's what's done is done. So the best is to not look behind and try to move on and find new things to do. That summer, actually, 2012, I was asked by FIFA to join their consultant roster. And I started working with the development department for initially men's football side. But then in 2014, there was a great project starting on the women's football side with administration courses that would be taught basically all over the world for either women who are working on men's side or women's side, or men working on women's football side. And the idea was to upskill women in football and also to get better opportunities for women's football. And with that project, I went around to close to 30 countries to do workshops, courses, help on strategic plans. And that gave me a good understanding of what's going on in the world, but also see that your problems are not specific to you or to your country. Women in most parts of the world in football were not treated well, discriminated, working in difficult conditions, and having to deal with societal prejudices as well. And that's how this leadership course that we run today for women in football was also born.
And what are the main areas of that course now? What are the main elements of the programme?
Well, the way it came about is actually in 2014, I went to an authentic leadership development program at Harvard University. And it's a lot about self-discovery, self-awareness, understanding your strengths and weaknesses, blind spots, and how to improve yourself. I mean, self-improvement, and prepare yourself for bigger leadership positions and leadership challenges. And up till then, I hadn't realized many things, first of all. One, I was always, well-educated, hardworking, expert in several areas, but I had blind spots as well. And there was nobody around me that I could trust who would tell me the truth, who would look me in the eye and say, look, Ebru, these are the areas you need to improve. Because unfortunately, structures in football don't have the governance or the HR support, or, you're just on your own and trying to survive. And up till then, I hadn't even realized that what I was doing as a woman was so unique, so rare, so unusual. I was just a good top level executive. I didn't think I was special because I was a woman. And then I started thinking, oh my God, I have been subject to so many, discriminations and sexism and difficulties. And I didn't complain about it at all, because I was just happy to be there, to be advancing, to be part of this really dynamic environment. I mean, I love football. I love working in football. And it was just this magical time and period. And I always thought every time I had a difficult period, it was my fault and not necessarily the systemic shortcomings, let's say. So that course in 2014 made me realize, oh my God, if I had worked for an organization that would have helped me to improve my leadership skills and send me to a course or some training back in 2008-9, when I was approaching 19, 20 years in my career. That's a very important turning point usually, because you start managing bigger and bigger groups and budgets. I mean, the budgets were like $200 million. I had about 500 people reporting to me. And worst is obviously boards of 15 men coming from all walks of life. And you had weekly board meetings, and you standing up and trying to be heard and explaining, we cannot spend money, we're over budget, you're being overruled. So it's very difficult, it's a very difficult environment. But that's when I realized I need to help other women, because if there was someone there to help me through this process, pointing out my blind spots and teaching me how to fail better, because it's not realistic to think that nobody fails. Everybody fails. They just don't talk about it, right? If you don't normalize failing, then it's such a disappointment for yourself that you're, embarrassed, ashamed. You become even more aggressive and more ambitious. In 2014, I said, I need to go out and tell my story, but also teach other women to be resilient, to better understand their strengths and weaknesses, to work on their soft skills. So that's how the course was born. And initially, it was more about the self-discovery part, as well as some skills such as decision-making, negotiating, networking, project management, time management. And then over time, especially when we started teaching it with women in football, we also added modules for confidence, public speaking. So now it turned into a 4-day program. We're also teaching them financial literacy, managing budgets, understanding a bit about clubs' finances, and really whatever their role is, preparing them for the next step in their career. And a lot of the times leadership is overglorified. People think, I have to be a CEO in order to be a leader. No, you could be the head of a department of 3 people. You are a leader of that department. But it's just feeling comfortable with yourself, with your skills, and enjoying what you're doing. And that will help you to make a difference.
And you've obviously had huge success at Galatasaray and throughout your career as a female leader. So do you feel you were different as a female leader to the men that were around you at the time?
First of all, I think that motherly instinct always kicks in. And it wasn't for me just about going to work and getting paid and doing a good job. But I was truly passionate about what I was doing for the club to make it bigger and better and have better governance and, better youth development, better recognition outside of the country. So, and what I see from many of my female colleagues and counterparts is the women really look for that purpose in what they do, and that really makes them align their strongest capabilities with their strongest motivations. And if they're able to tie that with a purpose, then my God, you cannot hold them back. They will go wherever they want to go. And this course also is helping people realize that if you're lacking certain capabilities, don't think that your capabilities are limited. Many of the skills can be learned. If you're not motivated with what you're doing, think about what motivates you. Don't wait for a tap on the shoulder because it might never come. Certain people, your bosses might not think that you would be interested in an overseas job or a new position. So do have the courage to volunteer yourself for that next step and prepare for it as well. Going back to that inclusion and connection part at the beginning of our talk, the course also provides people with the understanding that they're not alone. I mean, a lot of the times you cannot say out loud what your problems are, either because the environment at work is not right, or you don't have anybody to share with at home, or whatever. But when you start talking and realizing that whether you're working for a governing body or a small club or a community club or in the media sector, all of us are having very similar problems. And finding solutions together is always much easier than trying to cope with it yourself. And
Absolutely.
Football has been very good at providing that connection and being the connector.
Fantastic. And are you happy with the rate of change that we're seeing in women's football now today?
I think especially if we look at the last decade, the growth in women's football especially has been tremendous. And people are very impatient, and already they're saying, why should we invest more in women's football? There isn't enough spectators, there isn't enough viewership, there isn't enough sponsors, infrastructure is not there. But go back to 1992 when the Premier League was set up. It took 18 years for Premier League to have international viewership, international investment. It's a long period to turn things around and make it as glamorous as Premier League. It just takes a time. And today, if an investor has $1 million, let's say, and if he or she is thinking of going into a textile mill or buying real estate, whichever investment it is, it never produces a return on investment in year one, right? You have to be patient, invest, lose money for a few years if necessary, and the ecosystem needs to grow up as a whole altogether. So from fans to better broadcasting opportunities to, players on professional contracts, not having to work 2 or 3 jobs in order to make their living, better facilities for training and stadiums. It's a big ecosystem. And now is the best time to go back to the drawing board during this crisis and to think about who has football left behind over the years. The growth has been tremendous. Look at UEFA's report. It talks about men's football. 21 billion of revenues generated in Europe in 2017-18 season. Women's football, we don't really know, probably not even 1% of revenues. But if you look at the World Cup viewership of men's World Cup versus women's World Cup, only 1/5 of men's viewership is with women's viewership. So the gap is not that big.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the prize money is 7 times less. Sponsorship is probably 0.001%. So it's a matter of time before investors and brands and sponsors realize that youth football, women's football, grassroots football. This is what the essence of football was to begin with, before it became so commercial and such a big global business. I sincerely hope that a portion of this vast revenue generated globally from football is invested and reinvested into football for good side. And there is not only the social side of it, but there is also commercial good coming out of all the other parts of football as well. And I think a female leader would probably understand and embrace this much better. And
I agree.
I think that now is a great time when, unfortunately, most people would probably lose their jobs, but there is an amazing group of very talented, overlooked women who are in the football industry. I would love to hear one of the governing bodies or clubs to say in the next year, only hiring I will do will be diverse candidates.
Well, hopefully, we'll wait for that. I hope so.
Wonderful.
Just very recently, the US women's team obviously hugely disappointed in terms of their equal pay case being thrown out before it even reached court recently. I know they're going to appeal that. Can you see a time when we will have that parity in terms of pay, proportional wages, and also around prize money? If you look at the campaign around the FA Cup across England this year as well.
Yeah. Again, going back to my investment thesis, I think there is a big role for the sponsors to play. Okay. So the prize money, the salaries, who are they paid by? Broadcasters and sponsors. Their only concern up till now has been whether they're receiving awareness, exposure, and whatever their KPIs was. But I am certain that none of their KPIs was related to governance, diversity, equality, or other measures. So I think, hopefully, like they did in the US equal pay case, some of the sponsors spoke out and asked the US Soccer Federation to withdraw their previously put out arguments that were degrading for women. So going forward, I sincerely hope sponsors as well as fans really hold clubs, governing bodies, leagues accountable for their distribution of revenues and salaries and prize money. And yes, for the moment, the women's football side might not be generating as much revenue, but that was partially because it was never put out there as a separate valuable product. It was always put in a package, bundled as an unwanted right, okay? So you're buying the men's cup, well, you just get the women's rights along with it. And for those big brands, sometimes their main concern was to implement and activate the rights that they have gotten on the men's tournament side. But maybe there are other buyers for the women's side, other brands who really value these different value propositions of the women's game, the family aspect, the health aspect, more the grassroots approach. And it gives them a blank white page to start and put their brand out there with the right kind of messaging. And it allows some smaller brands to come in as well who couldn't afford the men's sponsorships, for example.
That's fantastic, because that was actually going to be my next question was, in terms of women's football, what will generate more growth and funds in the future? Is it about linking the women's team to the men's commercial side or to uncouple?
I think uncoupling for sure, but also I think there are some regulatory and licensing steps that can be taken. And again, that same UEFA report says that only 36% of the top flight clubs in Europe have a women's team.
Wow.
Only 36%. So imagine that you make it a club licensing requirement to have a women's team or to link up with a women's team, like Real Madrid did. They were one of the latest comers into the game. They ended up buying a standalone women's team. And this is the case in CONMEBOL. CONMEBOL makes it a prerequisite. If you don't have a women's team or if you don't have an alliance with a women's team, you cannot participate in the Copa Libertadores or Copa Americana. So that's very, very important hook. And again, the budgets are very, very small. It wouldn't be a big burden on European clubs who are participating in Europa League or Champions League. And that would be a big jump start.
Yeah.
In the same way, even though I am not a big believer in quotas, because that could end up in tokenism a little bit as well, but quotas always help jumpstart the process. Same thing could be for mandatory women's seats for member associations, clubs, and that can really speed up the whole process of transformation.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I've got one final question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing just where you are within your career and a huge inspiration, really. So I wonder what advice you'd give to women in sport who are progressing in their careers now.
First of all, definitely continue investing in yourself and learning. It's a never-ending process. And the more you discover about what you don't know, the stronger you will get, because that will give you the confidence to try new things. And a lot of the times it's very difficult to be recognized, heard, to speak up. But if you have that one angle of expertise, whether it's finance or legal or marketing or something else, then there will always be a room for you at that decision-making table. And whatever inhibits you, whatever crushes your confidence, try to work on it. Especially if you express out loud your inner voices, you start realizing how silly and stupid they are. And having mentors and sponsors to talk to, coaches to talk to, is extremely helpful. No one can go up that ladder on their own, and having the support system is extremely important.
Thanks to Ebru for sharing so much about her life and career. It's so inspiring to hear her story and all she's achieved and how passionate she is about equality in the women's game. Thanks also to Barclays for their ongoing support for the Game Changers podcast, which enables us to take the stories of these amazing, fearless women in football to a huge new audience. If you're enjoying the podcast, it would be fantastic if you could give us a rating or leave a review. You can also let us know what you think on social media, where you'll find me at Sue Anstiss or The Game Changers on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. You can find out more about all of my marvellous guests at fearlesswomen.co.uk. Thanks to Sam Walker from What Goes On Media, who's been a brilliant executive producer for the Game Changers podcast. Next week, I'm talking to footballing legend Rose Riley. The Scottish FA wouldn't let women play the game when Rose was growing up, so she set off for Italy to play professionally and won 8 league titles, 4 Italian Cups and the World Cup. It's an absolutely fascinating story.
There was a boys' team, the Stuart boys' team, and the coach asked me if I would play with them. And I said, oh God, that'd be great. And he said, well, you need to go to the barbers and get a short back sides, boys' haircut, and you'll need to change your name from Rose to Ross.
The Game Changers. Fearless women in sport.